Hi everyone, welcome back. I think everybody's having a good semester so far. I really like the results that I'm getting. This is great stuff. So I'm having a good time. I hope you're having a good time. I hope you're learning some things. It seems like some of you guys are really enjoying some of the discussion board posts. We have some really great responses. Some of you guys are putting a lot of time and effort into that, and I really appreciate it. And some of you guys I know you're enjoying some of the comments I've made and some of the lectures I've done, and I appreciate the feedback that way as well. Yeah, I do. Sometimes I run into some very humorous examples I would use in an in-person class. So it's nice that I can communicate some of that to you in this way. For example, things about my wife. And in an in-person class, I talk about my wife all the time because she's a walking, talking sociological example of, I don't know, a whole lot of things that we would tend to find amusing. But anyway, so I hope you guys enjoyed the last lecture. I know some of you guys really thought that stuff was kind of funny. So I got some other stuff we're going to talk about today. The next discussion board post has to do with capitalism and the idea of monetization. Monetization means putting things in terms of dollars and cents. Pretty common thing we do here in America, particularly. In fact, that's the root of this particular lecture, is the idea of capitalism as an economic system, which also influences both social and political systems as well. Arguably, and this is a Marxist perspective. Some of you guys have probably read in the textbook about Karl Marx. He's one of the great sociological thinkers, and he's one of the first people to sit down and actually critique the system of capitalism. He did this in the 19th century, which makes him a towering figure in both economics, literature, politics, and a whole bunch of other fields. We tend to have a negative view of Karl Marx in America because he criticized capitalism, and capitalism as an economic system to us is very important. But think about it this way. The only reason you care and think the capitalism and free market and so on and so forth is so great is because you were born here and you've been told that over and over again. It's the same thing we've been talking about since the beginning of the semester, the idea that the only reason you look at an American flag and you see freedom and liberty is because people have told you that that's what it stands for, and because you happen to live in America. So your entire life, people have been telling you how great it is to live here. But realistically, most of you probably have no real experiences in other places, and there's plenty of other countries out there. I think that if you go to any other country, most of the people living there will tell you whatever country they live in is the best country in the world. So you got this sort of, we would refer to that as being very subjective, meaning that it's not taken in any meaningful or scientific way. It's just something that you're told over and over again is good, and we tend to accept that as valid. I know we talked about that a lot in some of the previous lectures, but capitalism is the same sort of thing. Most of us embrace a capitalist ideology because we've been told over and over again how good it is, or it's the only thing we know. So realistically, it is what it is, but Marx was one of the first people to criticize it and point out its flaws, and many of its flaws, as Marx pointed out, have to do with the idea of monetizing, putting things in terms of dollars and cents, the monetization of things that have intrinsic value, but ignoring that intrinsic value and instead focusing on how much money can you get for something, how much is it worth, what's the exchange value, etc. But also, additionally, one of the biggest issues in capitalism is the fact that it's rooted in competition. So it pits people against one another. On a very broad social level, we have lots and lots of large-scale conflicts that we can be described or at least critiqued in terms of understanding the role of money and the role of wealth in those particular things. Most sources of conflict in American society are rooted in money and wealth. We don't tend to express it that way in a lot of cases, but it is a fact. That's how it is, and we can describe that. I mean, if you think about like racism, for example, right? We use racism as an example. If you think back to the roots of racism against African Americans in this country, an idea of slavery, that's rooted in money. It was about making profit. You could have people that'll work for free, you'll force them, compel them to work, and then you enjoy the profits if you happen to be white. So again, it's rooted in money. And even today, in the lasting legacy that we have with dealing with racism, particularly in the 1950s and the 1960s and the Civil Rights era, this was primarily about getting access to things that white people had access to: jobs, education, the careers, things like that, home ownership, being able to get a loan to buy a car, or personal loans and things like that. Those were things that African Americans were not allowed to get. Legally, most institutions would not give them those sorts of things. They didn't have the rights and privileges white people did. And most of the time we can express this conflict between whites and African Americans in terms of dollars and cents. At this time, during the Civil Rights era, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, they simply wanted access to the same things, the same material goods, the same material rights, the same access to wealth that white people did. They wanted to be able to own a home and grow equity. They wanted to be able to send their kids to school so they could get a good career. When my dad was a mailman for 35 years or something like that, and when he went and applied for his federal job as a mailman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 1970s, he went down there with a black friend of his that lived nearby in the same neighborhood. My dad was very poor growing up, and he lived in a mixed neighborhood, but was predominantly black because it was poor. in Milwaukee at that time was largely segregated along racial lines. When he went down and applied for that job, they told his friend who was black, don't even bother because we're not going to hire you because you're black. That's a fact of life, right? It's a fact of American history. It's inescapable. But again, if you think about it in terms of dollars and cents, racism makes sense if you explain it that way, in that if you're white and you have access to ways to accumulate wealth and you can shut out a segment or a portion of society so that you don't have to compete with them, it would make sense to do that. Now, we look at that and we say, well, that's reprehensible, that's awful, how can we do that? Even though in many of our institutions still do these sorts of things in many ways, even if it's a little bit more subtle currently as they did in the past. But that's the basis for racism in this country. It's competition. Who's going to get what, right? Who's going to get theirs? Making money, getting jobs, education, things like that, things that cost money, home ownership, things where you accumulate wealth. And if you look at things like sexism too, it's the same sorts of things, right? If women can't work, which is arguably for the first 250 years or so in this country, women were shut out almost exclusively from many types of jobs beyond simply secretaries, nurses, and grade school teachers. They couldn't be professors, they couldn't be principals, they couldn't be doctors, right? They couldn't be lawyers, but they could be those certain types of jobs, and then almost exclusively homemaker. And it's the same sort of thing. If you can keep women from getting into these professions, then as a man, you have to compete with far less people for a job. So it makes sense, right? As a guy, you're like, well, if I can shut out 50% of the population from competing with me for that job, or for entrance, or for getting admitted into that college, or from that career, or from getting a raise or a promotion, why wouldn't you do that, right? We're taught as very young people growing up in this country that competition, competing for wealth, competing for resources is the most important aspect of our lives. Most of what you do can be expressed in terms of dollars and cents because capitalism is the basis for our society. Like it or not, it is, right? You can say, well, I'm a socialist or I'm a communist, but you still live in a capitalist society, so it doesn't even matter. You have to engage in those institutions. And unfortunately, those institutions that we're talking about, educational institutions, political institutions, even the institution of the family, right, they're usually typically characterized by different types of competition, people competing for resources and power and wealth and influence, et cetera, et cetera. So those things are lasting legacies and derived directly, and I would argue, and Karl Marx certainly did, from the system of capitalism, which at its basis is corrupt, because you can't get away from the fact that some people have access and can accumulate more wealth, which translates to power, than other people, simply because of the way they're born, their color of their skin, where they happen to live, lots of different things that we can't really account for in terms of meritocracy, right? Like aptitude or intelligence or things like that. Some people are just born rich, some people are born poor. And in this country, it's something like an 89% chance that if you're born poor in this country, you're going to stay poor because you don't have the ability to accumulate that wealth. And our institutions and their capitalist society are set up to keep it that way. That's just a fact. That's why we have struggled so hard to eradicate poverty in this country when we easily could, because people don't want to give up what they have, right? We might donate to something, give some money away, or donate around the holidays, but bottom line is, you kind of like your house, you kind of like your car, you kind of like the clothes you wear, you kind of like having your iPhones and things like that. So you don't want to give those things up. You're taught not to want to give those things up. So I'm not saying it's okay, but I am saying that it's excusable. And believe me, look, I'm wearing a shirt, Banana Republic, right? You probably noticed I wear a lot of Banana Republics. They don't give these away, right? These are not cheap. So I'm part of this institution, part of this society too, right? I buy consumer goods. I do the same things you do. Even though I'm aware of what's going on, I do it too, just like you do, because I'm part of a capitalist society as well, and it's almost inescapable. I'm going to school to get a better job. So are you, right? Dollars and cents. Those kinds of things. So for the next discussion board, what I want you guys to talk about is I want you to talk about ways that things are monetized, things that have intrinsic value, things that are worth something, but we only talk about them in terms of dollars and cents, or we only talk about them because they have some sort of monetary value. And that somehow promotes an idea of status or a privileged position. A lot of times if you own a home, you'll have people over to your home. If you have an apartment, maybe you don't entertain people because it's not as big, it's not as nice, right? Those kinds of things where the value of the home itself, right, is a place to raise a family or have a husband and wife or however, whatever kind of spousal situation you have or whatever the case may be, right? It's not a center of happiness because it's a home. It's somehow we're more concerned about the size of our home or where the home is located. Whether we rent or own is a huge consideration, and the size and the niceness of the furniture and all those things determine a lot of times our social standing and our social worth as far as we're concerned and when we're competing with other people. keeping up with the Joneses is this the saying that goes along with that, right? They get a new car, or they buy something else, or they do something to their house, right? And then a lot of the people in the neighborhood will do the same sort of thing, because we understand there's a social standing that's associated with this sort of lifestyle, a middle class lifestyle. So what I want you guys to talk about is I want you to come up with some examples. I'm going to run through a few of them here just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. But the argument, it would be that capitalism sours everything in a sense. It turns everything into a conversation about money. And we can point to a number of different things and say, well, there's intrinsic value there, but we're less concerned about that. And for the most part, we're talking about like personal things. I want you guys to think about in your own life, or things that your parents have done. Like for one thing, we could talk about is jobs and careers. I'm going to ask you to come up with an idea associated with this, and this will be written down in the discussion board prompt, but I want you to think about this. In terms of the jobs we do, for the most part, the jobs people do are not the jobs they want to do or they'd like to do. They're the jobs they have to do. My dad didn't want to be a mailman. He had to be a mailman because he had to, quote, pay the bills, right? He had to put food on the table, however you want to put that, right? However you want to express that. He didn't want to be a mailman. He had to be a mailman. And it paid pretty good. It's a good union job. There's lots of stability there. He got regular raises, cost of living raises. He had benefits. So even though he had to walk around in 120-degree heat delivering mail in Phoenix, Arizona for 35 freaking years, for him it was a good job. But if it was up to him, he would have been doing something else. And actually, the thing he wanted to do, his childhood dream, the thing he wanted more than anything in the world, that if he could be anything, like rock star or baseball player or astronaut, he wanted to be, and I'm not kidding about this, a bus driver. He tells me that when he was a little kid and all his friends were playing things like astronaut and stuff like that, he would play bus driver in his room, and he'd set up a fake bus thing like chairs and be like, all aboard, get on, all right, next stop, Main Street, all right, like ridiculously stupid if you think about it, and kind of innocent and sweet in a certain way, but I think most of us would look at it and say that's just kind of pathetic as far as the dream goes, but it's what he really wanted to do. And here's the kicker. He worked 35 years driving a mail Jeep delivering mail in Phoenix, Arizona, and then he retired and he gets a pension. Now he is a school bus driver. Why? Well, because they don't pay very much, but now he doesn't need the money. He couldn't be a bus driver when he was growing up, or when I was growing up, when he was trying to support a family, because it didn't pay enough. Didn't matter what he wanted to do, he had to do what he had to do. And that was not a job that he wanted to do, but it's because of money, right? If he wanted to live in a house in a middle-class neighborhood in suburbia and drive a car and be able to pay for things for your families and go on summer vacation and live a nice, I guess we would say, decent lifestyle, then he had to do a job he didn't want to do. And that's unfortunate, right? Most of us are going to end up in that boat. Sorry, but that's a fact, right? Nobody grows up as a kid saying, I want to be an accountant. But at some point, maybe in your college career, you realize that you can be an accountant and you get paid pretty well being an accountant. So you're like, what the hell? I'll go be an accountant. It's stable work, it's good work, and it pays well. That's a fact of life in a capitalist society. We don't get to do those sorts of things. And this is unfortunate too, because when my dad retired, he actually, and this is what kind of gets at this, and I'll give you an example. We also monetize things in the sense of like, we don't pay for things based on what they're worth intrinsically. For example, musicians that are in parts of orchestras don't get paid very much. Despite their talent, despite their acumen, despite their abilities, despite the fact that neither you or I could probably go do what they do and they have this amazing gift, they don't get paid very much. Artists, right? Most of you, if you're interested in art, have been told over and over and over again, do not be an art major, you will not make money. And there's probably some truth to that. So it doesn't matter how much you want to do it, you can't. Because in a capitalist society, you got to pay the bill. Now, some of you guys might go on to do sorts of things and be very successful, but it's very rare that that's the case. Most of you guys are probably going to be business majors or something like that, because people have told you over and over again, go into business or engineering because that's where the money's at. Doesn't matter if you like it. Doesn't matter if it's your passion, right? For the most part, we have to give those things up as we get older. And take note of that, because I'm going to be asking you guys to come up with an example, if you can, about somebody that had to sacrifice something they really wanted to do something that they had to do in order to, quote, pay the bills or at least live a decent life. And I don't think you're going to have any trouble coming up with an example, and that'll be on the next discussion board as part of this particular project. But if you think about it, like my dad, as I continue the example of him, when he first retired from the post office, he got a job at CPS, Child Protective Services. And the idea was he is a very nice man and he's good with kids, and so he thought, well, I could really make a difference here. They didn't pay him very well, and they worked him very long hours, and there was always these extra requirements to work when he wasn't getting paid and do work on the weekends and things like that. And he quickly realized that it was an awful job. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It was an awful job and a thankless job. And it's one where he had to deal with these horrors of how children are treated in our society. And he had to bring this home every day. And he's retired. And he's thinking to himself, why am I doing this? He would tell me stories that after a few weeks, I would tell him, please don't tell me anymore. I don't want to know about these things. I don't want to hear about these things. They're so awful. I won't even tell you some of the stories he told me about the mistreatment of children, the abuse of children that he had to deal with on a daily basis. Pardon me. And they paid him very, very little to do this. And after about 3 or 4 months, he had to leave because he couldn't handle it anymore. Now, that's the kind of job that's important. It's the kind of job that makes a difference in people's lives, little children's lives. Most of us would take that very seriously and say that's very important to us. And yet they don't fund these positions. Nobody wants to pay for these sorts of things. And the people that go into this do this because they have a certain desire to make a difference, but they're not rewarded enough to have to actually to compensate for what they actually have to deal with and what they actually have to do. And there's an extremely high level of turnover. It's one of the reasons why in Arizona in particular we have a lot of problems with the case backloads for child abuse and things like that never go investigated. And you hear all the horror stories and you pick up the newspapers, probably something in there today about CPS quote failing again. And part of that's because they don't pay people to do the job. And when you got to put food on the table or you got to pay the bills, and you have a choice between doing something like that where you have to deal with these awful, horrible realities every day, or something that's very easy or very simple or maybe even enjoyable in some ways, or at least more enjoyable than dealing with child abuse, you're going to take the easier job. That's just a fact of life in a capitalist society again. So that's another example of how things like the wealth or the health and well-being of children are subordinated to the capitalism, and the idea of competition. Making money is far more important than taking care of children. Again, it's a harsh reality. It's a fact of life in America in a capitalist society, and that's one of the reasons these problems are systemic. People just don't care enough. Like, you might care, and you're like, oh my God, that's awful, but what are you going to do about it? Probably nothing, right? And again, I'm part of this problem too, so I'm not blaming anybody, but this is why these things go on so often. But nonetheless, so those are sorts of things that maybe you can point to. Maybe you can come up with some examples for things like that. But there's also ways that we monetize certain aspects of our life, personal aspects of our life, and they suggest something about like dollars and cents equating to some criteria by which we're judged. For example, think of it this way: how do you express love in our society? By buying people stuff, right? Valentine's Day, Christmas. How do you know how much your parents love you? Well, at Christmas time, they bought me a whole mess of presents. Therefore, my parents love me a lot, right? Now, I know it's kind of glib, and you're probably thinking, well, that's not true. Yeah, it is true. Because for the most part, that is exactly how we understand, and especially as a child where you don't really know, right? If your parents leave you a lot of presents, you're thinking, wow, they really love me. Or birthdays, right? Wow, my parents had a really great party for me, and they bought me all this stuff, and they took me to a special place, and I had all my friends. My parents must really love me. And as an adult, you'll continue these sorts of traditions with your children. And part of it, whether we want to admit it or not, has to do with the fact that we understand that buying stuff for people expresses a certain amount of sentiment. Now, part of that too is the value of something, right? We always talk about it's the thought that counts, but come on, we know that's bullshit, right? Pardon my French, but come on, right? We'll say that to people, but we all know that deep down inside we're thinking how much it costs matters. Again, whether we want to admit it or not, it does, right? When I first met my wife, right? I told you, I got a lot of wife stories. She continuously railed against Valentine's Day. She works in the floral industry, and she would always say over and over and over again how much she hated Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is so awful, so blah, 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 right? Go on and on. So stupid. What a waste of time. What a waste of money. And because she deals with flowers, it's the most trying, most stressful time of the year for her, and she hated it. So for the first Valentine's Day when we were together, I think I got her a card, and that was it. How do you think that went over? Right? Doesn't matter how much she hated it. Plain fact of the matter is, she's an American, and she lives in America, and she understands that buying something for somebody on a special day of some kind has meaning and value and expresses some sentiment. And when I didn't get her a Valentine's Day gift, it didn't matter that she continuously told me how stupid Valentine's Day was. She still wanted that present because it was supposed to express something about how I felt personally about her. And so again, just like when I brought up the whole, you don't do a whole lot of outdoor stuff, I quickly learned a lesson that I will never forget, which is I will buy her something on every holiday that it has something to do with love or relationships. I will never forget an anniversary or birthday or Christmas or anything like that. That's for damn sure, because I learned my lesson. Now, that's one of the things we do. And we can get even more specific than that. Think about like in terms of like when you're really in love with somebody, right? You have a relationship that's going really well and you're really super in love, you get engaged, right? So what do you buy in order to signify that you guys are really truly in love and committed for a lifelong time? An engagement ring. Lots and lots of money. Several $1,000s on an engagement ring. Probably, it depends, right? I think 3 months salary, right? So $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $5,000, something like that would be the going rate for an engagement ring. Maybe 1 or 2 if you're trying to do it on a budget, because you realize that it doesn't really matter, because nobody really gives a crap about the quality and clarity of a diamond, because nobody knows unless you tell them. But it has meaning. It has value. It's important, right? If you get engaged and you don't have an engagement ring, people in our society will be like, what? He didn't buy you a ring? That's ridiculous. Does he love you or not, right? Well, again, whether we like it or not, it's a fact. That's how it goes. And then, of course, when you get married, right, you're supposed to have this big blowout wedding. And I don't know about you, but I've been to about 30 or 40 weddings in my time. And the weddings that were, I don't know, cheap, the weddings that weren't in very nice places, or they didn't put a lot of time and effort into it, however you want to put that, you'd hear people say, well, I don't know how long this is going to last. They didn't even bother to rent a hall to have the reception in, right? I went to a wedding once to a friend of my girlfriend's at the time, this was years ago, and the reception was in the backyard of her dad's house, and people were like, I could hear people snickering and talking and going, well, this is going to last very long. That they didn't put any money into this because they clearly figured it wasn't going to last very long, and it didn't. So they were right. But I don't know how much the money had to do with that. But that's what we think, isn't it? So you have to have the big blowout wedding, and you have to have the big fancy dress, right? And you have to have all the big flowers and the really fancy dinner settings and stuff like that. That's an expression of love. Wow, they really love each other. Look how much this wedding cost. Again, we may not always want to admit that. We may not always want to believe that, but that's true. And many of you guys are probably out there thinking to yourself right now, yeah, I've done that. Yep, I want that big wedding because I know what it signifies, right? And it's not a problem. I'm not criticizing anybody. I'm saying that's a fact. That's how we do things. These are kind of examples I want you to come up with for the next discussion board. I don't know what you have going on in your personal life, but I can guarantee you that you've made sacrifices for money reasons, right? Whether it's because you have to work more hours so you give up doing certain hobbies that you'd like to do because you need to pay the bills, right? Whether it's because you had to take a second job because you can't afford to go to school, but if you can't afford to go to school, you know you're not going to get a better job, right? Maybe you've been the subject of discrimination or prejudice at a workplace or something like that. Maybe you didn't get promoted because you're a woman. Maybe you didn't get hired because you're old. Maybe you didn't get hired because you're young, something like that, where some sort of racism or discrimination came into play because people were competing for these jobs, right? Competition was the problem. So those are the kind of things you can be asking you guys to come up with. I hope that you kind of enjoyed my few examples. I could give you 1,000 more, but I don't want to take them all from you guys. But those are kind of things I want you to talk about, how things are monetized. Think about it this way. I'll give you another example real quick before I leave you. You ever watch Antiques Roadshow? And people bring in these precious family heirlooms, and they spend all this time talking to the appraiser, and the appraiser gives them all this history, and they will stand there and they watch, and they're watching this, and you see my camera, and you can tell that all this history and stuff, and they'll say things like, well, I really want to know more about it, and stuff like that. Is that really what the people care about? Is that what the people at home care about watching the show? I watch Antiques Roadshow. I love the show. Is that what people care about? No, right? What do people care about when they're watching that show? The money. They want to know how much it's worth. And the family members want to know how much it's worth. And they'll say things like, oh, it's grandma's diamond necklace. I would never sell it. Yeah, right. You know, as soon as they find out it's worth $35,000 and they have this bundle of cash sitting there and they realize that they don't really care and grandma's long since dead, they'll rationalize it. They'll figure out a way to go out, and sell that diamond necklace because they realize that the money is more important than the memories. Happens all the time. That's the idea of what I'm talking about here, right? The monetizing of goods. It's not the intrinsic value, it's the monetary value, right? And then maybe it's shameful, maybe you think it's sad, but I guarantee you're a part of it because you're a part of a capitalist system. And there's really no way to escape it. You can change the system, but you're just one person. So most of the time we just kind of give up and just give in. And that's why I called the next discussion board selling out, right? Because that's what we refer to that as. But I mean, it may or may not be an appropriate, apropos term, but I think we all understand what I mean by that. But anyway, so those sorts of things. Give it some thought. See what you can come up with. I don't think you'll have any trouble finding some things. Okay. Anyway, having a good time. I hope you're having a good time. Talk to you soon.